Let me start with a simple observation. Most people don't really learn things. They collect words. They memorize definitions, formulas, and fancy phrases. They can repeat them back perfectly. But the moment you ask, what does this actually mean? Everything falls apart. That's not learning. That's storage. Real understanding is something very different. If you truly understand an idea, you should be able to explain it to a smart 12-year-old. Not by dumbing it down, but by stripping it down, removing the unnecessary words until only the idea itself remains. And if you can't do that, there's good news. You've just discovered exactly where your understanding is weak. That's the heart of the Feynman Technique. First, you take an idea and try to explain it as simply as possible out loud or on paper. No jargon, no impressive vocabulary, just plain language. Second, you notice where you get stuck. These are not failures, they are signals. Each confusion tells you precisely what you don't yet understand. Third, you go back to the source. You fix the gaps. You don't memorize the explanation. You rebuild it. Finally, you simplify again and again until the idea feels obvious. Because here's the truth. If something is really understood, it feels simple, even if it took years to get there. Memorization gives you confidence without knowledge. Understanding gives you knowledge without needing confidence. And that difference matters. In science, in school, and in life, repeating words is easy. Thinking is hard. But thinking is the only thing that actually works. So stop asking, can I remember this? Start asking, can I explain this? Because the test of understanding is not whether you can repeat the answer. It's whether you can create it from scratch. And when you do that, you're not just learning facts anymore. You're learning how to think. Many people believe they understand something simply because they can repeat it. They can recite a definition word for word, remember a formula, or quote a paragraph from a book. And that feels like knowledge. But this feeling is often misleading. Memorization creates familiarity, not understanding. When information is memorized, it sits in the mind like a label stuck on a box whose contents remain unknown. The words are there, but the meaning behind them has not been examined, questioned, or connected to anything real. The problem with memorization is that it works only in very narrow conditions. As long as the question looks exactly like the example in the textbook or the one on the slide, the memorized answer appears to function. But the moment the situation changes slightly, the knowledge collapses. Ask the person to explain the idea in their own words, apply it to a new problem, or connect it to something they already know, and the confidence disappears. This is because memorization does not build a mental model. It does not explain why something works, only what words are associated with it. Understanding, on the other hand, is active. It requires taking an idea apart and seeing how each piece fits together. When you truly understand something, you are not dependent on a specific phrase or formula. You can arrive at the idea again. Even if you forget the exact wording, you know where it comes from and how it behaves. This kind of knowledge is flexible. It adapts to new problems and unfamiliar situations because it is rooted in meaning, not memory. One of the biggest dangers of memorization is that it creates false confidence. People who memorize will often believe they know more than they do because they can perform well on tests or repeat impressive language. This confidence can prevent real learning because there is no motivation to question or explore further. If the answer sounds correct, why dig deeper? But real understanding often begins with discomfort, with realizing that the words you know are not enough. Another weakness of memorization is that it fades quickly. Facts learned without understanding are easily forgotten because they have no strong connection. They are isolated pieces of information floating on their own. Understanding creates connections between ideas, between causes and effects, between abstract concepts and real experiences. These connections make knowledge durable. Even if details are forgotten, the core idea remains and can be rebuilt. Memorization also limits creativity and thinking. When people rely on memorized answers, they stop asking questions. They look for the right response instead of exploring possibilities. Understanding encourages curiosity. It invites questions like, why does this work? What would happen if something changed? And how does this relate to what I already know? These questions are the engine of learning, science, and progress. This does not mean memorization is useless. Some facts, formulas, and vocabulary must be remembered. But memorization should be the result of understanding, not a substitute for it. When you understand something deeply, remembering it becomes easier and more natural. The mind remembers meaning far better than isolated words. The key idea is simple. Knowing the words is not the same as knowing the thing. Real learning begins when you stop trying to store information and start trying to make sense of it. When you focus on understanding, knowledge becomes something you can use, adapt, and trust, not just something you can repeat. Many people assume that understanding is demonstrated by complexity. They believe that if an explanation sounds technical, uses advanced vocabulary, or is filled with equations and jargon, then it must reflect deep knowledge. In reality, the opposite is usually true. The ability to explain an idea simply is one of the strongest signs that it has been genuinely understood. Simplicity does not mean being shallow. It means celerity. It means the speaker knows which details matter and which ones are distractions. When someone truly understands a concept, they can separate the core idea from the decorations surrounding it. They know what must be explained first and what can wait. They can build the idea step by step in a logical order without hiding behind complicated language. This is not easy to do. It requires a level of mastery where the idea feels natural rather than memorized. Simplicity is not achieved by removing effort, but by applying more thought. Explaining something in plain language forces honesty. When technical terms are removed, there is nowhere to hide confusion. If you do not understand a concept, you will quickly run out of words when trying to explain it simply. You might find yourself repeating the same sentence in different ways or jumping ahead without explaining how you got there. These moments reveal gaps in understanding that memorization often covers up. In this way, simple explanation becomes a powerful tool for learning, not just teaching. Imagine trying to explain a complex idea to someone with no background in the subject. You must think carefully about analogies, everyday experiences, and basic principles. This process forces you to revisit the foundations of the idea. You cannot assume knowledge that has not been established. By rebuilding the concept from the ground up, you strengthen your own understanding. Teaching in simple terms is often more educational or the teacher than for the listener. There is also a difference between knowing an explanation and owning it. Memorized explanations belong to someone else. A textbook author, a lecturer, or a slide presentation. Simple explanations are personal. They are created, not copied. When you explain something simply, you are expressing your own mental model of the idea. This is why two people who understand the same concept can explain it differently, yet both explanations can be correct. Understanding is flexible. Memorization is rigid. Another reason simplicity signals understanding is that it focuses on causes rather than description. Instead of listing properties or outcomes, a simple explanation shows how one thing leads to another. It answers why instead of just what. When you understand the cause of something, you can predict its behavior in new situations. This predictive power is a clear sign that learning has gone beyond surface level knowledge. Simple explanations also make knowledge usable. Ideas that are trapped in complex language are difficult to apply, especially under pressure. But when an idea is clear and intuitive, it can be recalled and used quickly. This is true in problem solving, decision making, and creative work. Understanding turns knowledge into a tool, not just information. Finally, the goal of explaining simply is not to impress others, but to check yourself. The real audience is your own mind. If you can explain an idea clearly without ing on jargon or memorized phrases, you can be confident that you understand it. If you cannot, then the problem is not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of clarity. And clarity is something that can always be improved by going back, asking questions, and thinking more deeply. When people encounter confusion while learning, their first instinct is often to avoid it. Confusion feels uncomfortable. It creates uncertainty and exposes gaps in knowledge, which can feel like failure. As a result, many learners rush past the parts they do not understand, hoping that clarity will somehow appear later. They memorize the steps, accept the explanation without questioning it, and move on. This habit is one of the biggest obstacles to real understanding. Confusion is not a sign that learning has gone wrong. In fact, it is evidence that learning has begun. The moment you feel confused is the moment your mind has reached the edge of what it currently understands. Beyond that edge lies new knowledge. If you pay attention to confusion instead of running from it, it becomes a guide. It points directly to the exact place where your understanding is incomplete. Every concept is built from smaller ideas. When one of those pieces is missing or unclear, the entire structure becomes unstable. Confusion tells you which piece is weak. It may be a definition you accepted without thinking, an assumption you never questioned, or a step in a process you followed without knowing why. Identifying this weak point is incredibly valuable. Instead of studying everything again, you now know exactly what needs attention. Treating confusion as a signal changes the way you learn. Instead of asking, how do I memorize this? You begin asking, what don't I understand yet? This shift turns learning into an investigation rather than a chore. You are no longer trying to absorb information blindly. You are actively searching for missing links. Each moment of confusion becomes an opportunity to strengthen your mental model. Another important aspect of confusion is that it humbles the learner. It reminds you that understanding is earned, not assumed. Even people with years of experience encounter confusion when facing new or complex ideas. The difference is not that experts never get confused, but that they recognize confusion as part of the process. They slow down, ask questions, and examine their assumptions instead of pretending to understand. Ignoring confusion has consequences. When gaps are left unresolved, future learning becomes harder. New ideas often depend on earlier ones. If the foundation is weak, everything built on top of it feels shaky. This leads to frustration and the false belief that the subject is too difficult. In reality, the difficulty comes from unresolved confusion that has been piling up over time. Engaging with confusion requires patience. It may involve revisiting basic ideas, looking at alternative explanations, or approaching the concept from a different angle. Sometimes it means admitting that an explanation you accepted before does not actually make sense. This can be uncomfortable, but it is also freeing. Once the confusion is resolved, the idea often becomes much clearer and more satisfying than before. Confusing also encourages deeper questions. Instead of asking what to do, you start asking why things work the way they do. These why questions lead to insights that memorization can never provide. They transform passive learning into active thinking. Over time, this habit builds confidence, not the fragile confidence that comes from memorized answers, but the solid confidence that comes from genuine understanding. In the end, confusion is not an enemy of learning, it is a partner. It highlights the path forward. When you learn to notice it, respect it, and investigate it, confusion becomes one of the most powerful tools you have. Each resolved confusion strengthens your understanding and brings you closer to thinking clearly and independently. Many people approach learning as if the mind were a container that needs to be filled. They read, listen, highlight, and repeat, hoping that enough exposure will cause knowledge to stick. This approach treats ideas as finished products that can be stored and retrieved when needed. But real understanding does not work this way. Understanding is not about storing information, it is about building it. When you memorize an explanation, you are borrowing someone else's thinking. The words may sound clear, but they are not truly yours. You know the result, but not the process that produced it. Rebuilding an idea forces you to engage with the reasoning behind it. Instead of accepting conclusions, you trace how those conclusions are reached. This shift from storage to construction is what transforms information into understanding. Rebuilding an idea means starting from what you already know and working forward logically. You ask what assumptions are being made and whether they make sense. You examine how one step leads to the next. If something feels like a jump, you slow down and investigate. This process may feel slower than memorization, but it is far more effective. Each step you rebuild strengthens your mental model and makes the idea more stable. One of the advantages of rebuilding ideas is that it makes knowledge transferable. Memorized explanations work only in familiar situations. Reconstructed understanding adapts to new ones. When you know how an idea is built, you can modify it, extend it, or apply it in different contexts. You are not limited to repeating what you learned. You can use it creatively. Rebuilding also reveals hidden assumptions. Many explanations rely on ideas that are taken for granted. When you memorize them, these assumptions remain invisible. When you rebuild the idea yourself, they become clear. You may discover that an assumption only works under certain conditions, or that it needs to be justified more carefully. This awareness deepens understanding and prevents errors that come from blindly following rules. Another important aspect of rebuilding is that it turns mistakes into useful feedback. When you try to reconstruct an idea and reach the wrong conclusion, the mistake shows you where your reasoning went off track. This is far more informative than simply getting an answer wrong on a test. Each error highlights a misunderstanding that can be corrected, strengthening the structure of your knowledge. Rebuilding ideas also changes your relationship with authority. Instead of relying on textbooks, teachers, or experts as the final source of truth, you begin to trust your own reasoning. This does not mean ignoring experts, but engaging with them critically. You compare their explanations with your own understanding. When they match, your confidence grows. When they do not, you know exactly what to question. This approach requires effort and honesty. It is tempting to accept explanations that sound convincing and move on. Rebuilding forces you to confront what you do not know and work through it patiently. But the reward is deep clarity. Ideas that are rebuilt are not easily forgotten because they are connected to reasoning, not just words. In the end, learning is not about collecting answers. It is about developing the ability to think. When you rebuild ideas instead of memorizing them, knowledge becomes something you own. You can explain it, challenge it, and use it. That is the difference between having information and having understanding. People often assume that when something is simple, it must also be easy or shallow. They see a clear, straightforward explanation and think it came from a quick thought or a lack of depth. In reality, simplicity is usually the final stage of a long and difficult process of thinking. What appears obvious at the end is often the result of struggling with confusion, complexity, and many failed explanations along the way. Complexity is easy to create. You can always add more details, more terms, and more conditions. You can hide uncertainty behind layers of explanation and make an idea sound impressive without making it clear. Simplicity is harder because it demands that every part of the explanation earns its place. Anything that does not directly serve the core idea must be removed. This requires judgment, understanding, and discipline. When someone truly understands an idea, they know which details are essential and which are optional. They can see the structure beneath the surface. This allows them to explain the idea in a way that feels natural and almost obvious. But this sense of obviousness is deceptive. It does not mean the idea was always simple. It means the complexity has been organized and resolved. Reaching simplicity often requires confronting confusion repeatedly. You try to explain an idea, realize it does not quite make sense, and go back to rethink it. Each revision removes a little more confusion. Over time, patterns emerge. Relationships between ideas become clearer. What once felt tangled starts to feel orderly. The final simple explanation is a summary of this entire process, not a shortcut around it. Simplicity is also a test of honesty. If you do not understand something, you cannot make it simple without losing accuracy. You may oversimplify, distort the idea, or avoid explaining key parts. True simplicity does not ignore complexity, it absorbs it. The simple explanation still respects the limits and conditions of the idea, but it presents them in a clear, coherent way. Another reason simplicity reflects deep understanding is that it makes ideas easier to use. When an idea is clear, you can hold it in your mind as a whole. You do not need to remember a long list of rules or exceptions. You understand the underlying principle, and the details follow naturally. This is especially important in problem solving, where mental overload can lead to mistakes. Simplicity reduces that load. Simplicity also improves communication. Ideas that are simple can be shared, questioned, and improved by others. They invite discussion instead of shutting it down with complexity. This is how knowledge grows. When ideas are clear, others can test them, challenge them, and build on them. Complexity without clarity isolates understanding instead of spreading it. It is important to remember that simplicity is not the starting point of learning. Beginners often demand simple answers too early, before they have done the work needed to understand them. True simplicity comes at the end, after careful thought and exploration. Skipping this process leads to shallow explanations that only look simple on the surface. In the end, when an idea feels simple, it is a sign that it has been deeply understood. The confusion has been resolved, the structure has been revealed, and the UN necessary details have been stripped away. Simplicity is not a lack of depth. It is the visible result of deep thinking. Many people judge learning by how well they can repeat what they have been taught. If they can recall a definition, list the steps of a method, or choose the correct answer from a set of options, they assume they understand the material. But repetition only shows that information has been stored, not that it can be used. The real test of understanding is creation, the ability to produce an explanation, a solution, or an idea without relying on memorized patterns. When you truly understand something, you can rebuild it from scratch. You may forget the exact words you once learned, but you can still arrive at the idea through reasoning. This ability is crucial because real problems rarely look exactly like the examples you have seen before. They require adaptation. Creation forces you to engage with the underlying structure of an idea rather than its surface form. Repetition is passive. It trains recognition, not thinking. You see a familiar question and match it to a familiar answer. This can be useful for drills or basic practice, but it breaks down when conditions change. Creation is active. It requires you to decide what principles apply, how they connect, and what steps make sense. This process reveals whether you truly understand the idea or have only memorized its appearance. Creating an explanation is one of the strongest demonstrations understanding. When you explain something in your own words, you are not copying, you are translating. You choose what to emphasize, what to explain first, and how to connect ideas logically. This requires ownership of the concept. Any gaps in understanding become immediately obvious because you cannot explain what you do not understand. Creation also involves generating solutions, not just recalling them. In problem solving, this means you can approach a new problem, even one you have never seen before, and reason your way toward an answer. You may make mistakes along the way, but each attempt is guided by understanding rather than guesswork. Memorized knowledge leaves you stuck when the path is not obvious. Understanding gives you options. Another important aspect of creation is that it strengthens learning. Each time you reconstruct an idea, you reinforce the connections that support it. This makes the knowledge more durable and easier to recall later. Unlike repetition, which fades when practice stops, created understanding becomes part of how you think. It integrates with what you already know. Creation also builds confidence of the right kind. Memorization-based confidence depends on familiarity. It disappears when the situation changes. Understanding-based confidence comes from knowing that you can figure things out, even if you do not immediately know the answer. This kind of confidence encourages curiosity and persistence rather than fear of being wrong. In learning environments, creation is often undervalued because it is harder to measure. Repetition is easy to test. Creation requires open-ended questions, explanations, and reasoning. But these are exactly the skills that matter most outside of exams. Life does not ask you to choose from 4 options. It asks you to think. Ultimately, understanding means you are no longer dependent on the original source of knowledge. You can recreate the idea, explain it to others, and apply it in new situations. When you reach that point, learning is no longer about remembering answers. It becomes about generating them.